Hey everyone, Judicial Watch President Tom Fitton here with a special election crisis update. I'm honored to be joined by Phil Kline with the Amistad Project for the Thomas More Society. Phil is a former Attorney General for the state of Kansas, and he and his organization have been involved not only in bringing to the fore issues as it relates to the election crisis in terms of whistleblowers, but actually going into court and pursuing these issues in the various states. And Phil, I'm honored to be with you here, and I'm all excited. Everyone thinks, well, Judicial Watch, why are you having on this group that also does election integrity work? I'm like, we need more groups doing election integrity work. What's been
Well, yeah,
the last few years, and I'm sure you've run into the buzzsaw with your new litigation, is how few of us are on the side of the rule of law and election integrity, and how many of them are on the other side.
absolutely. And Tom, it's an honor. I appreciate all the work that you do, and you've identified it correctly. And then we also have to fight the deconstruction of our culture and the deconstruction of language. I mean, the rule of law is premised on a basic understanding of the definition of words. But when we're in litigation, where these blue state governors can consolidate their counting centers into arenas the size of 2 football fields, and says it's good enough to have a Republican in the place of the counting and put them in the cheap seats where they can't see, we have a deconstruction of language and a deconstruction of law, and we become lawless. And that's what we saw in this election. Lawlessness.
Talk a little bit about the Amistad Project. What is it that brought you all into this? I know that Thomas More Society, as I've always known them as a religious First Amendment rights organization, but obviously you've seen a crisis here that you wanted to get involved in.
Well, early on, I would say 2 years ago, I started to become concerned about the potential for digital manipulation in our election system. And at that time, it was widely known within the expert community that there were inherent flaws. And my concern came about because my wife and I were delegates to a congressional convention to nominate and elect our Republican congressional candidate when my wife was denied the ability to be seated because the voting rolls showed she voted in a Democrat primary, which she never voted in. And in fact, hundreds of Republicans suddenly had voting histories that they had voted in a Democratic primary that they never voted in. We ended up seating all these delegates. But I went back, and our polling books are horrific in Virginia. And the penetration of those polling books by foreign and domestic sources indicates a great vulnerability in our election system. So that's how I got involved. It was really on the digital side.
Right.
But then COVID hit. And as COVID hit, you saw all these blue state governors, they started saying, we're not part of the lawmaking process. We are the law. What I decide when I wake up in the morning, you'll get arrested if you don't agree. And they started messing with election laws. And the other thing we saw, Tom, as I was looking at the digital side, is I started to see the flow of money and the design of that flow of money from Mark Zuckerberg into our elections, beginning in about April, right after David Plouffe, Obama's campaign manager, published his book, The Citizen's Guide to Defeating Donald Trump. We started to see Zuckerberg, who Plouffe was working for at the time, and all this talk.
I didn't know that he was. I knew the Obama gang worked for Zuckerberg, where he had been hired. They had hired many of them, but not Plouffe. Yeah.
Yeah, and we started to see the talk and chatter of a sleepy 501c3 that had been around for about 7 years, called the Center for Tech and Civic Life, ingratiating themselves into the election process. And through that, they started talking and reaching out to Democrat strongholds for them to apply for grants from CTCL for money they didn't have. Now, that's always interesting.
It'd be like if Judicial Watch started giving money to Palm Beach to run elections. What do you think? How would you think the left would react to that? A, is it legal? And B, is it a good policy?
Yeah, I can't imagine that if America pauses, you can justify a billionaire or an organization buying up local election offices and dictating to them how they're managing their elections. That can't happen. If it was the Koch brothers or the National Rifle Association, you can imagine. But that's
I got to say, this all goes. This is my theory of the case, or one of my theories. I've got a lot of theories, as you might imagine. But Zuckerberg and Facebook were decimated by the left for allowing the Russians to place a six-figure buy, or so we're told. We're not even sure that if it actually happened, since it's never been proven in court or shown in court, that supposedly impacted the 2016 election. Ever since then, everything they've been doing, whether it be the targeting of conservatives, pushing and suppressing, pushing fake news and fake information about the security of our elections and voter fraud, and suppressing critics of the left narrative to push mail-in balloting and to ignore voter fraud. And in the case of Zuckerberg, I'm sure it was made clear to him one way he can get back in the good graces of the radical left, in addition to suppressing conservatives and President Trump, is to give money to these left-wing groups that were manipulating the election process, as you point out, through direct grants that were not generally given out, but to left-leaning counties to help them better get more left-leaning votes. Does that sound right to you?
I think it is. I mean, you're assigning an intent to Mr. Zuckerberg. I'm not sure if that intent is accurate. I know that the flow of funds and what he has done matches that as an intent. I would add another.
You're too much the lawyer for me here, Phil.
Well, I'm sorry. Well, it's the prosecutor side, beyond a reasonable doubt, all that stuff. But
and I'm not testifying.
I would add another possible intent, and it's a lazy one. It's actually an arrogant belief that they know better. And we are creating in this nation, and it's not just Facebook and Zuckerberg. There's a group called the Center for Election and Innovation Research. You go down and you've got True the Vote, the Vote at Home movement, all these groups on the left that are sharing monies with government in return for government giving them information and access to information. We are actually creating a corporate oligarchy. We have a different form of government in that direct representative democracy or a representative republic is not the power that's driving this right now. It is globalization. It is corporate profits. It is a belief that they know better. That's what you see on the left. I mean, I can't remember where in the Constitution, and maybe I need to read it again, where it says, we promise you will be safe from all disease, and therefore your freedoms are subject to us having the power to keep you safe.
Well, yeah. Well, and as importantly, they use that as a justification to upend virtually every election security measure we have in this nation. It's not just the battleground states that had their laws upended, but virtually every state that kind of blew the lid off blew the top off in terms of mail-in balloting, because there aren't enough states with voter ID. They're weak as it is, and they were completely nullified, more or less, by this vote by mail tsunami. Now, I do want to focus on your lawsuits. You filed, what, 3 lawsuits now in Georgia, Wisconsin, and Michigan?
Oh, we're in Pennsylvania. We're in Arizona. We altogether, the project has had about 23 lawsuits.
Well, I'm talking about lawsuits targeting the actual election results and trying to change.
Yeah, since the election.
Reinstate the reality of who won, as opposed to what we're being told, who we're being told won.
Yes, and what those lawsuits now include, and as you know, one of the challenges, Tom, before the election that we had in our litigation was standing, concrete harm, and that's one of the conundrums as it relates to election litigation, is you can prove the harm once the blood is in the street after the election. And so now we've been able to establish that. We are showing through our experts that there are hundreds of thousands of ballots in play, that our litigation includes, for example, over 100,000 ballots between these 6 states that involve people that voted from out of state into the state. We have over a couple 100,000 ballots where we have contacted Republican voters who said that they filled out an absentee ballot and that ballot is not reflected as being counted or received by the state. We have several 100,000 ballots where the Republicans said, I didn't request a ballot, but somebody did and cast it in their name. I mean, all of that is being put up there. And as you said, with these consolidation of the counting centers, with the evisceration of the protection of the integrity of the absentee ballot, with the lack of the chain of custody between drop boxes and the counting centers, we opened the door for the direct infusion of fraudulent ballots into the election system. And that's what this evidence shows has occurred. Now,
haven't the courts, I'm not a lawyer, but let's put it this way, I'm an expert layman in the law. And I've been around long enough to see how easy it is for the left to get into court. Why is it that the court, and this is a rhetorical question, I'll turn it into a statement. It is frustrating that the courts are fearful of allowing you and your clients to go into the courts and make your case. I mean, these are civil rights claims you're bringing. You would think that this was completely alien, that a court could knock out several thousand ballots or so. It happens all the time. We're not talking about knocking out millions of ballots. We're talking about validating the millions of legal ballots and not having their votes, their direction obviated by illegal counting and law breaking. Why are the courts so fearful here? It's remarkable. Usually there's at least one or two judges who say, yeah, I see what's happening here, and we're going to do something about it.
Well, you know, it's interesting. I think if you step back, everybody has serious concerns about this election, if they're rational and they think it through. But courts are very, very hesitant when it comes to complex fact-finding and competing arguments to make what is essentially a decision to put their judgment above the political process of voting. So there is a high burden to get a judge to pay attention here. And I think the noise of our culture prevents that to a certain degree. I would say this, and this is what we are trying to get the court to recognize. This election was an unprecedented election in American history. You had essentially a shadow government. We have tracked over $500 million that went from various, Zuckerberg as well as other leftist causes directly into the counting rooms of this election. That makes it necessary for the judges to step in, especially the evidence of fraudulent ballots is not their primary concern in how we structure a judicial case. It is the disparate treatment of the voter. And they are seeing a new look at an old strategy. At the turn of the century, of the 20th century, the Democrat Party of the Deep South suppressed the black vote and tried to enhance the white vote. You know, targeting a demographic to increase the vote is the opposite side of the same coin as targeting a demographic to suppress the vote. The difference this time, it was Republicans and Democrats, and it was the urban core. All of these violations, all of these altered procedures, all of the unprecedented management of the election occurred in the same locations, and that's the swing states in Democrat-controlled urban core cities. And that's where the Zuckerberg money went. He actually paid the election judges. America was kicked out of the counting room, a billionaire behind the doors. That should reach the Supreme Court. And I don't know if we'll be successful, but we're trying real hard.
Well, there's, there's times are wasted, right?
Yeah.
On the outside, you have them less than a month, right? The Electoral College meets next week. And then after that, Congress then blesses the Electoral College vote, or maybe not, in January of 2021, January 6th specifically. Is it too late for the courts to, well, I know it's not too late. Practically speaking, do you see an opportunity in any of the litigation, including your own? But I wanted you to talk about other litigation that's out there
Sure.
that our listeners and viewers should know about, where the Supreme Court could come in and save the day in terms of election integrity.
Well, I think so. Our audience is not just the Supreme Court, it's also state legislatures, which have enormous authority here. Many authority that many legislators don't realize they have. But yes, there's some litigation out there. Let me speak first to Julie Levin's litigation in Pennsylvania that's being appealed up. Justice Alito, who oversees the Third Circuit, expedited that process, and that is challenging Act 77 in Pennsylvania. I think that's a strong suit, and it's possible that Act 77, which was their voting act under COVID, could get tossed, and that means Pennsylvania goes away. I will also say our litigation is still moving through the process.
That's litigation that is being pursued by a member of Congress and a candidate for Congress.
Yes.
Lost. And they're challenging the constitutionality of the radical changes by the legislature and governor to the law.
Yes. And I think that's a strong suit. It's good arguments. That's Congressman or the candidate is Mr. Parnell, and it's moving forward in Pennsylvania. Our litigation is moving forward, and we're going to file new litigation. Let's see, today's Monday, tomorrow, which argues that these really arbitrary deadlines in statute passed by Congress of when the Electoral College safe harbor date is, December 8th, and when they meet, December 14th, is a violation of due process, as well as a violation of the legislator's responsibility and duty to examine the election. You know, if you look at the history of that, you go way back, it was determined by how long it took to ride a horse to Washington. And so we shouldn't limit our understanding of what happened in the election by these deadlines when the only constitutional deadline is Inauguration Day. So we have more time. We're trying to say we have more time. We're also arguing and putting forth that argument with legislators as well through RC4.
Well, practically speaking, they have more time. I mean, the Electoral College will have, there will be slates that Congress will have to accept whether or not the Electoral College meets or which slates are designated by the legislature versus the governor. But you raised a question I've been kind of harping on. So one of these laws you may have a problem with is 3 U.S.C. Section 1, which mandates that Election Day takes place on Election Day and that we have to pick our electors on Election Day. And it seems to be at odds with the idea that we have someone who wins on Election Day based on the votes counted then, but then that result changes days later. And it's never before been, at least in modern American history, as best I can tell, any similar circumstance where we've changed the outcome of Election Day presidential contests in post-Election Day counting. A, it seems at odds out the face with the law. B, it obviously invites opportunities for fraud, which is why it was frowned upon anyway. And then C, there's another law, 3 U.S.C. Section 2, which says if they don't pick them on Election Day, then the legislature can do what it needs to do. So it seems to me like an easy solution. The president won on Election Day. The votes counted after Election Day, they don't count. And they don't count for the reasons we've talked about. We don't know where they came from, practically speaking. They were counted in a way at odds with state law. And thirdly, they were counted illegally and illicitly in terms of a corrupt practice involved in handling it. It doesn't to me get more easy for a court to look at this and say, you know what, this is what the law is. You didn't do it. Too bad.
You would think so. And in fact, the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA, also reinforces that in that it requires a standardized definition of Election Day, as well as a standardized definition of ballot to be counted. And we didn't come close in either of those this election. So, you know, we're pushing that argument forward. We're still running into a very reticent bench wherever we go to step in. And, you know, Tom, you and I can talk about how the bench and these federal benches are not political, but these judges are reading the paper. They're wondering if they're going to be the only one who steps out and says, you know, enough is enough. This should not be considered a valid election. And until one does, nobody does. I know that sounds, of course, like a logical conclusion, but it is really a political statement. There has to be a judge out there who has the guts to do what the law requires him to do.
We had one state judge in Pennsylvania who was willing to take the steps seemingly necessary, and she got reined in immediately by the partisan Pennsylvania Supreme Court. So we've got three options. Supreme Court steps in, because the lower courts, no matter what's going to happen, the Supreme Court's going to have to step in one way or another to validate what went on.
That's right.
Secondly, we have the state legislatures who have the plenary authority, and our listeners know about this. They are the kings of how these electors are ultimately appointed. And if they think the election was improperly conducted, they can step in and appoint a clean slate. And then thirdly, Congress can throw out electors from states whose elections are compromised as well. Where are we? I guess the political side we should all be aware of, and our listeners and viewers should be calling their elected representatives, let them know what they think. But just to kind of round it up, where do we think we're going in the courts? How quickly do we think, what dates can we expect to hear from the Supreme Court in a significant way to let us know where they're going?
Let's see, is today Monday? It's all merged for me.
Monday the 7th, it's Pearl Harbor.
Okay. We're going to hear something this week in a couple of cases, I believe. And additionally, I believe we're going to see another case filed, potentially, that has original jurisdiction within the United States Supreme Court between states on this issue. So I would expect swift
state suing another state and asking the Supreme Court to take it up immediately, because the Supreme Court, under the Constitution, if it so chooses, can immediately adjudicate a dispute between states.
That's right. That's right. So I think all of these matters are going to move swiftly. I would anticipate by a week from Friday, we will know the answer to most of the litigation. I would still say, as you have mentioned, Tom, that there are still options available to legislatures as well as Congress.
Well, thank you, Phil Kline of the Amistad Project. And if people want to learn more about the project and its organization behind it, the Thomas More Society, what do they do?
Well, they can go to, there's a C4 that supports the messaging and influence of some of this at got-freedom.com. And then there's the Thomas More Society website at Thomas More, society.org that you can go to.
Well, good luck to you, and we're glad you're part of the fight, and we're glad and we didn't get a chance to talk about this, but we'll talk about it later. But we should recognize, Phil's been in the battles for a long time, and we have here at Judicial Watch. But what's happening this year is we have individual citizens, many of whom had zero experience with any public activity, let alone political activity, who are coming forward and risking it all to come forward to expose what's been going on.
That's right.
So, we should be rooting for Phil, rooting for Judicial Watch, rooting for the rule of law, but we should be praying for those witnesses who are coming forward at great risk to themselves to be tarred and feathered by the communist left and their allies in the media. So let's remember that as we close out.
All right.
Hey, thank you, Phil. We appreciate your time, and good luck to you. And we'll obviously be tracking very carefully and closely the ongoing election crisis here in 2020. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Merry Christmas.
Thank you. Bye-bye.